Welcome to the first episode of the Effective Literacy Podcast. I'm Victoria.
And I'm Anna.
And we are your hosts for this podcast about all things literacy and this kind of inquiry deep dive into what literacy is. So, how we're going to roll. On the first and third Monday of each month, we're going to drop a new episode. Most of our episodes are going to be about interviewing experts from across the nation with expertise in literacy and multilingual education. We're going to have some real discussions with them about how to support our students, specifically our multilingual learners, in becoming literate individuals by the time they graduate high school. However, Anna and I are also going to have some episodes that we're going to call Making Meaning episodes. Episodes where we sit down with just the two of us. Sometimes we're going to bring in friends that are classroom educators from across the country and really say, like, so we heard from the experts. So what does this mean for us? How do we really implement this? And what do we take from it to make sure that we're meeting the needs of our current students?
That's right. And so before we get too deep into the mission of the podcast, we want you to know who we are and why we love literacy. Victoria and I actually worked together at a county office of education years ago where we both provided professional development and support for teachers and administrators in regard to literacy instruction, as well as prioritizing that instruction for English learners. So I was a provider for TK through 8th grade teachers. And Victoria was...
I was the provider... I was that provider for grades 6 through 12 educators. So we had that overlap of 6 through 8.
Which you can already hear that we have a little overlap in these conversations because Victoria and I are not only past colleagues, but we actually are friends. And we have continued to have conversations throughout the years. But back when we worked together, we both spent time supporting each other. We would bounce ideas off of each other when we were supporting teachers separately. And then we also collaborated and worked together a lot to make sure that we were providing that literacy and English learner support for TK through 12th grade teachers all the way through. And so what we started to do in our work together was we started to make these connections around common literacy themes. What does it mean to make meaning, or what does it mean to effectively express yourself in writing? What does that look like? In my work, it was, so what does that look like for maybe a kindergarten teacher or a 3rd grade teacher? But then as our conversations continued, we realized, wow, so if that's what that looks like in 3rd grade, then Victoria would be able to come in and say, yeah, and that this is what it should look like for 8th graders. This is what it should look like for 12th graders. And what we started to notice was this really beautiful vertical alignment of those literacy themes. So over the years, we've continued to have conversations. Even though we have continued our journeys in education and have different positions, we continue to have our conversations about literacy and about how to best support teachers and implementing current research-based instructional practices.
And I also want to say, like, Anna and I, when we worked together, we had cubicles across from each other, right?
Which was so fun.
It was so much fun.
It was so fun.
But we totally always just would like kind of push back on our desks and wheel over to the other person's cubicle to have these conversations. And one of the things that I started to realize that was a common theme in what Anna was doing was every time she was talking about anything at all, she talked about the fact that teachers of reading need to read. Right. And Anna has hashtag teachers reading read. And we started to talk about this whole thing that so often as educators, we talk about reading. We encourage our students to read, but we ourselves aren't reading. And we're not talking about that. But then I started to say to Anna, you know what, Anna, I'm going to take it one step further. And I said, teachers of writing need to write.
Which is even more of a push.
It's a big push, but we need to be journaling. We need to, even if it's a bullet journal, even if it's an organizational journal, we need to be practicing, right? That metacognition of what happens in our brain when we're reading, when we're writing, we need to be vulnerable and we need to share that with our students. It's part of that learning experience. And Anna and I really started to see this, right? As Anna said, these common threads that whether she was telling a story of something that was happening in a TK classroom or whether I was telling a story of something that was happening in a 12th grade classroom, we saw this giant overlap. And so we just felt this immediate connection, this bonding. And as Anna said, we've become friends. We've stayed friends over the years. And years after we worked together, we both found ourselves as part of the National Committee for Effective Literacy. In the National Committee for Effective Literacy, this is really the mission and the vision of it. The National Committee for Effective Literacy uplifts research, policies, and practices to ensure that English learners, emergent bilinguals, leave school as proficient readers and writers in English and preferably more languages, and who thrive and succeed in schools and their communities. So Anna and I really started thinking about, you know what? This is an amazing mission and vision, something that we live by, we believe in. We're going to link it in our show notes. But we said, you know what? We need to connect with our other educators. And now that we're both working at different jobs, we thought a podcast is the best place to connect with it, all of you, right? And really to talk about what is working, because we're really seeing a lot of different policies that are coming down the pike. We're seeing a lot of theories that are coming down the pike, a lot of conversation about what is working in terms of reading instruction. We're also seeing a lot of emphasis on foundational skills. That if you have a student who is struggling with reading, you need to go back to phonics and foundational skills. And we just want to make sense of that, right? We want to think about what really is working. So we found a lot of articles. One article we really connected with, and we felt that we need to link it in our show notes for you. And it talks about this whole idea of the theories of reading instruction and the role of phonics and how like it's been this giant pendulum swinging since the 1950s. And I remember my first year teaching, and my mentor teacher, right, said to like go into a teacher who had recently retired. She's like, let's go into our classroom and see what she left behind. And she's like, oh my gosh, there's this class set of books. There's this class set of books. There's this, take them all. And I was like, what am I going to do with all these books? And she goes, you never know what's going to work, right? She goes, if this book connects with this student, then you're going to use that book with that student.
Right. Which, to go back to what you're saying about being a teacher of reading who reads, the purpose of being a teacher of reading who reads is not only to, expand our own experiences, but also so that we know our kids and that we can connect them with books, because the piece of literature or the textbook or the article that you may have taught in years past may not connect with your students like it has in the past. And so if you have a plethora of books or you have read something new recently that you're like, oh my gosh, if I have a student who has a similar experience or who might connect with this book, it's going to allow me to say, hey, I read this book over the summer, and I think that you actually might really like this. So the purpose of that teacher of reading who reads is not only just for ourselves, but also that we can communicate and connect better with our students and also explain to them like, yeah, I read this book and it was historical fiction. I really liked it. And here's why. Whether they pick it up or not, they also see someone as being a reader. And so the podcast is going to pull together all of these best practices that we know. It's going to allow us to examine and hear from our national experts around literacy and multilingual education, because as classroom teachers, we're getting a lot of information right now. And it's confusing. And if you've had 15 years in the classroom or 15 hours in the classroom because you're a brand new teacher, it might be helpful to have somebody to go to listen and say, okay, now I'm going to listen to Anna and Victoria. They're going to meet up with some of their colleagues. They're going to hear from national experts, and then they're going to have a conversation around, so what does that research mean for me in my classroom? And how is that going to impact the choices that I make as a teacher?
And I'm just going to add one more thing about like the teachers of reading. Like the other thing is, in that metacognition that comes back to, like, I'm always talking about that metacognition, is this idea that sometimes we pick up a book and we don't connect with it. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's really important that we share that with our students, right? That there isn't a one size fits all book, and there isn't a one size fits all like theory or model. And so like sometimes like we might really connect with a book. We recommend it to one of our students, and our students are like, oh, Miss Belitsky, this totally doesn't work for me. Right. Yeah. And that's fine. That's okay. We need to celebrate that. And we need to think about what does work for those students. And how do we know that those things are still research based? And so that's really kind of what we're trying to dig at here in this podcast. And we are very much learners in this. We are believers. We are both educators in California. And I mean, I have to give a giant shout out to our California ELA ELD framework. That framework, it's so important in the fact that it was the first framework that really said that English learner development is so important that it needs to be combined with content development. And so it was English language arts and English learner development together. And there's these beautiful themes in it that talk about the themes of literacy that Anne and I believe in. We'll definitely talk about that throughout our podcast and link it in the show notes for you that are out of state and are unfamiliar with those frameworks.
So don't forget to join us on the first and third Monday of each month. Until next time, we are the Effective Literacy Podcast.